I'm Julie Barkey with Senate Update. News of a roughly $2 billion budget surplus sparked the great legislative debate. Should that money be spent, saved, or given back to Minnesotans? The governor, DFL, and GOP each sounded off on this issue. The governor and DFL stating there should be more money appropriated to education, while the GOP states a big chunk of it should be sent back to Minnesotans. Here are their news conferences from Friday.
Minnesota's good economic news continues, fueled by our continued strong economic growth. Our state's budget surplus for the next biennium has increased from the $1,037 million in last November's forecast to $1,869 million now. That's an increase of $832 million, caused principally by Minnesota's continued economic growth that exceeded economists' projections just 3 months ago. It's important to put this budget surplus in its proper perspective. When I took office in 2011, our state was still in the clutches of the Great Recession and was facing yet another projected budget deficit. The legislature and I dealt with it in 2011 in the same way that the previous governor and legislature had dealt with their previous recessions and deficits. We reduced spending and increased borrowing. Fortunately, Minnesota's economy has turned around, and in fact, our state has led the nation's economic recovery. Our success has produced this surplus. It hasn't come from higher tax rates, as some will claim. Tax rates haven't changed since the last legislative session. This surplus comes from more Minnesotans working than ever before in our state's history, and from more of them earning higher incomes than before. So what should we do with our collective good fortune? Some will say, well, let's give it back to ourselves. Let's spend it ourselves on things that we want and need. That has appeal, for there are certainly things that most of us want and need. However, we have no assurance that this national economic recovery will last indefinitely. History assures us, in fact, that it won't. Inevitably, there will be another national economic slowdown or downturn, and Minnesota's economy will be affected like everyone else's. Our budget surpluses will disappear. So I propose that we invest our collective good fortune in our collective better future, in education and transportation, for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for the generations that will follow. Since we may not have the same opportunities in the years ahead, it's even more important that we make those investments now. My January budget proposal focused on those two principal areas, education and transportation. They will remain my focus in my supplemental budget proposal, which I will submit the week of March 9th after Management and Budget has repriced the current spending in light of the new forecast. I will propose to fully fund universal pre-K for all of Minnesota's 4-year-olds, which is partially funded in my current budget. That will cost an additional $238 million in the next biennium. Universal pre-K also frees up additional scholarship money for low-income parents to afford good child care for their children ages 0 to 3. And my child care tax credit will help working parents better to afford those costs for their children. Affordable higher education is also a crucial investment in our better future. The University of Minnesota has said that an additional $65 million will enable them to freeze tuitions for the next 2 years. My present budget proposal would pay for half of it. I'll propose to fund the rest at an additional cost of $32.5 million. In addition to the $30 million I propose to improve the medical school, my proposed additional funding for the university will total $95 million. I will propose the same $95 million of additional funding for MnSCU, which will fully fund a tuition freeze for the first year of the biennium and half the cost of a freeze for the second year. I'll ask them to fund the other half through administrative savings. And I'll propose adding another $25 million to the state grant program to help students and their parents better afford those college educations. My proposed additional increases in higher education funding in my supplement, that's total $152.5 million. A couple of other priorities are to restore funding for the Minneapolis Park Board that is previously budgeted $3.7 million for the biennium, and to set aside $50 million to implement the expected recommendations of my Child Protection Task Force. Those new recommendations total an additional $444.2 million out of the additional surplus of $832 million. I look forward to working with the legislature, who now has the definitive budget for the rest of this legislative session. Look forward to seeing their proposals come forward, both the House and the Senate, and having the opportunity to work collaboratively together to create a still better future for the people of Minnesota. I'd be glad to respond to questions.
Governor, at your budget release, you said that increasing spending for nursing homes would be high on your new priorities.
It is, and there's still, as I said, there's still almost $400 million that's on reserve here. I don't have the right, what I consider to be the right approach to that, but I do agree that there'll be additional funding necessary, and I think the legislature is looking at a couple of options for that now.
What's your view of the calls for increased local government aid?
Well, I put increased local government aid into the transportation proposal. The counties get, and cities and townships get 28 cents out of every dollar, so there's over $2 billion of additional local government aid for over the next decade from my proposal, and I think it'd be more productive to target that additional money on roads and bridges, and they have those needs certainly. But the counties in particular get an enormous amount of additional money, cities as well, but especially the counties. And that's the approach I would prefer to take.
Governor, why is it not proper, in your view, to give the money back, to offer tax cuts, rebates, some sort of payback to the Minnesota taxpayers who made this surplus happen?
Well, I mean, as I said, that's an appealing option, because there are certainly things that people want to spend additional money in their pockets on. And I have proposed a child care tax credit, so that's part of my previous budget proposal. I'm just saying that, look back historically, that was done in 1999, again in 2000 by the legislature and Governor Ventura. There were a string of budget surpluses then, and people were comfortable that those were going to continue, so they cut taxes permanently in those two budget legislative sessions, and then very soon thereafter the economy leveled off, and then went into the Great Recession, and they were looking at serious deficits for the next several years. So I'd rather avoid that possibility in the future, and probability somewhere in the future that we're going to go through another economic downturn. And if we cut back on permanently on the resources that are available, I expect either I or future governors and future legislatures will have to resort to some of the same strategies that did not prove constructive for the state of Minnesota, for education, and for the things that I'm proposing we deal with here. So, I'd rather see us invest the money from our collective good fortune in a collective better future for all of us and for our kids and grandkids. And I think the investments I've targeted here are in line with that priority for universal pre-K and for higher education affordability. And those are the ingredients that have made Minnesota successful, and more successful than most other states. And we have an additional challenge now with a diverse population to close the achievement gap and bring all of our children, our future adults, future taxpayers, up to a level of educational proficiency as we have before. And if we fall short of that, our economic future is going to fall short of what it should be and what it needs to be for the benefit of all of us. So I'd rather see us make investments in education that are going to pay off for Minnesota for years to come, transportation that are going to pay off for Minnesota for years to come, and lay the foundation for a better economic future and social vitality in years ahead.
Governor, would you characterize your viewpoint as more of a long-term approach than a short-term approach?
That's a good way to put it, yes. Thank you. I'll use that, thank you.
Well, why not, how about a one-time check instead of permanent tax checks?
That's been done before. It could be done. I mean, the legislature, I'm open to discussing with the legislature their views of the best uses of this money. It's the highest budget surplus, I'm told, in the state's history in dollar amount. So, you know, there are going to be other good ideas through the legislative process and how to best allocate it. But again, I think we're better off to make investments for the future, to take a long-term approach rather than a short-term approach.
Governor, you mentioned transportation several times. Does this alleviate the need for new revenues for transportation? Are you going to be willing to use some of the general fund money for transportation, or are you going to have the same fight that you predicted in January?
Well, I continue to believe that a dedicated revenue stream for transportation is essential to correct the deficiencies that have developed all over the state and to provide the base of funding for the next decade. You know, one-time additional money out of the general fund, out of what turned out to be a one-time general fund surplus was tried before, and it just gives a little boost to funding for that one construction season. But the highway builders tell me that doesn't really change. You know, they don't, without an assured source of funding, and an assured amount of funding in the years ahead, they're not going to make the capital investments in new and additional equipment for road construction. They're not going to hire the additional people to take on those additional projects. So it's an inefficient way to try to, you know, restore some of the deficiencies, and it's a one-year, one construction season deal. We need something that if it ends up being part of a long-term package that does not rely on general fund surpluses to fund the transportation improvements we need to be making every year for the next decade, then, you know, I certainly look at it. But it's got to be part of a long-term transportation solution.
Politically, doesn't it become nearly impossible to raise any new revenue given that we have a nearly $2 billion surplus?
Well, as I said, you know, you can use some part of that, transfer it from general fund uses for transportation purposes, but it needs, in my opinion, that would need to be paired with again, a long-term funding source. My proposal is for 10 years. The construction industry would say that they need that assurance of a reliable stream of revenues at a certain level to make the investments that they need to expand their capability to undertake these additional projects. So, you know, one biennium out of the general fund with no assurance of anything to continue thereafter is not a solution to our problems. And again, and I will object to anybody portraying it as a solution to the problem. If it wants to be part of this long-term solution, then we can certainly talk about that. But I don't want anybody here fooling themselves or fooling the people of Minnesota that you know, a one-time, one-shot deal is going to resolve anything.
Governor, you're restoring funding to the Parks and Rec Board and MnSCU. Does that signal that you're satisfied that they've resolved some of the issues you identified before in restoring the funding?
I'm told the Park Board and the Chair of the Met Council are going to have an announcement today that made some very significant progress, really a breakthrough. And I give great credit to the new Met Council Chair, Adam Dunnock, who really engaged with the Park Board. I give credit to the Park Board members. And this is a very, very significant move ahead for the Southwest Light Rail line. And so on that basis, I'm restoring the $3.7 million that I took out of their base budget for the next biennium. And MnSCU is in process. I'm going on still a bit of a faith that their discussions are going to lead to better rapport and better ability of everybody involved to move cooperatively and constructively ahead together. And if that doesn't occur over the next few months, the legislature will have an opportunity to assess that progress and make its own determinations. But you know, I want the tuition freezes have been very important for both the university and for the MnSCU program for the last 2 years, and the ability to continue them for the next 2 years is a significant incentive for me to be willing to take a leap of faith with them.
Anything else?
Governor, you predicted your critics saying that this came from tax increases. Specifically, they say you raised taxes by $2 billion, you have a $2 billion surplus. Did you need to raise taxes after all, now looking back?
Oh, we needed to raise taxes at the time to pay off the school debt and to deal with the projected deficit that we faced 2 years ago. And fortunately, our economic recovery has been strong. It surpassed expectations then. Every time we increase the surplus or reduce the deficit over the last 4 years, it's because of the improvement in our economy. It's also about the improvement that has gone above and beyond the experts' predictions in the last forecast. So $832 million more in the surplus from 3 months ago is really an exceptionally strong performance. And it's certainly not from any changes in tax code, and is from slightly less spending because of fewer people in poverty for education purposes, which is great news as well. I mean, we're a long way out of having kids in poverty, but at least that's improving. So, you know, it doesn't hold water to say that this is because of a tax increase. Going from in 2012, beginning of 2013, that projected budget deficit of $623 million for the upcoming biennium, and the $2.7 billion that we owed the school districts at that point in time. That revenue increase, I think I've seen about 2 zillion ads that said it was $2.1 billion. I'll take it as a word, but you know, 1.5 billion of that came from the top 2%. That money went to square our fiscal account, and now we're not looking at deficits anymore. We have a surplus, which again I would maintain if you look at the forecast of a year ago, and the fact that we actually cut income taxes in the last session and provide property tax relief. So, but from the forecast of a year ago to today, the surplus has grown considerably. Most of that increase, 1.89 billion. So it's good news for Minnesota. Minnesotans produced it, and now the question is how are we going to apply that to a better Minnesota?
Governor, any other prediction about the exodus of business? Corporate income's down a bit, but individual income is up. So what are we to make of that?
Well, you can find anecdotal evidence of businesses moving. You can find, I would say, even more anecdotal evidence of businesses that are locating or expanding in Minnesota. And our economy is thriving. We've got a 3.6% unemployment rate. If businesses were closing shop and leaving in any number, the unemployment would be going in the other direction. And we've got a long ways to go with our economy, get back to where we want to be and should be, and to give everybody a chance to find a good, well-paying job, which is why, again, the education piece is so important, because we need to educate our young people and we need to train them with the skills that are going to be necessary for the better-paying jobs in the years ahead. We have a labor shortage right now in Minnesota, places all over the state who cannot find particularly skilled workers in areas like engineering and construction and computer science and the like. So we need to be retooling our education system so we bring all of our kids into a successful, productive adulthood, and also in jobs that are going to pay them well. And that's going to be the key to our economic future.
Governor, tradition dictates that Republicans are resistant to any spending increases, and with them holding the majority in the House, and somewhat your controversy with Senator Bach, what will you do to move the Republicans your way? And do you feel that this situation, in light of the fact that our neighboring state of Wisconsin is applying previous tax policies that we've seen here and they're experiencing a deficit compared to our surplus, is there anything you could say about that?
Well, I think our economic success speaks for itself. We're not competing with Wisconsin or any other individual state. I want Wisconsin to do well. I want Minnesota to do better. And I think we are doing better, and I'm pleased with that. And again, I would go back to, I think, the fundamentals of our economic success for decades, and what we've applied here has been an investment in our people and the well-educated, hardworking, productive workforce, and the we have a difference of philosophies, and the Republican majority in the House gave them, by the voters of Minnesota, the authority to press for their priorities, and I was reelected, so I have the authority to press for mine, and the Senate's still here, so we have that balance, and we're going to have to work out an agreement by the end of the session that I expect will incorporate different points of view, and I've always said compromise means you agree to something you don't agree with, and I expect to have to compromise. I expect the legislators will have to compromise if we're going to reach a solution. So that's still out there to be formulated, but I'm hopeful that we'll do that successfully, and I've had a good relationship with Speaker Dowd, and I appreciate his candor and I appreciate his constructive involvement in resolving the deficiency bill, and I've had a good relationship with Senator Bach for decades, and we're both grown-ups, and we both are used to moving beyond a temporary blip, and we will continue to work to get together, and ultimately we all are accountable for serving the people of Minnesota. We might have different views of what that best entails, but ultimately we're all here for the same reason, to make this a better state. I see the speaker is now here with his arms folded, so he can elaborate on that as I leave shortly.
Do you think that the size of this surplus ultimately makes it easier to reach a budget agreement, or gives you more room to quibble over how to spend it?
Well, that's a good point. I think I'd certainly rather deal with the surplus than a deficit. I remember back in 2011 cutting over $2 billion in spending, and then dealing with the borrowing that was necessary. I mean, that was a very unpleasant task, necessary. So I'd much prefer the surplus. But there are a lot of groups out there, a lot of people. We don't take this revenue and sit on it, inflating government for its own sake. This money goes out the door through services to people, through direct payments to people, so paying for people's health care, paying for people's education, paying for the roads and bridges improvements. I mean, this revenue enables us to do things for Minnesota, do things that we can't do individually, unless you want to go out and build your own highway. I mean, it's just not feasible. So this is about what this is about what we put together collectively, not for government, this this sort of this evil alien force out there in the stratosphere. This is about we the people. We tax money is money we take from everybody to pool to do things we couldn't do by ourselves, that are going to benefit our entire state. And again, I go back to the years I've been involved here, which has gotten to be a long time now, under Republican, Democratic governors and, not presidents too, but governors, independent governor, legislators, Republican, Democrat, we have followed a model that has worked for Minnesota, and we ought to give ourselves credit for that. The people of Minnesota deserve the credit for that. The businesses of Minnesota deserve the credit for that. The policymakers of Minnesota deserve the credit for a much more balanced approach than a lot of other states who thought they just cut taxes and eliminate any environmental protections and just raise it to the bottom. That's going to boost them ahead, and the opposite has occurred. They've fallen, relatively speaking, farther behind. We've done well because we've been smart and invested well in our people, and our people have been great. They've responded. The business people have been great. They've responded, and we're enjoying the results of that now. I would urge that we don't just discard the lessons that we should have learned from that experience and proceed apace to do even better. Okay?
You're set for $850 million bonding proposal. Is that?
That's what I'm looking toward doing, and I have now in this proposal the additional cash to pay for the additional debt service for the next period of time. So that'll be forthcoming probably the second half of March.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Responsible DFL budgeting that includes lower spending and higher revenue are credited with the $1.86 billion surplus. Today's budget forecast of $1.86 billion, which is nearly double since the November forecast, shows that a DFL-controlled legislature, a DFL governor, enacted responsible policies that advance the growth and economic success of Minnesota. The February forecast released today is encouraging. It shows we're on the right track. We can now begin the important process of determining a budget for Minnesota. This forecast will provide the foundations for our budget conversations in the coming months. In our communities, we hope to hear the priorities of Minnesota and across the state. It will be their phone calls, emails, and testimony that guide our actions at the legislature. Minnesota had a structural deficit since 2001, and we can see from today's forecast that the work of the last 2 years under DFL leadership to create structurally balanced budgets put the state on sound footing. This forecast shows that an honest budget passed by a DFL legislature without gimmicks or borrowing has created the confidence and stability necessary for Minnesota's economic growth.
So a couple of things. I've been proud to have been a member of the DFL legislature in 2013, 2014, that obviously continues this year in a slightly different circumstance. But obviously what the governor's talked about and the success of today's forecast is illustrative not simply of what's happened in the last several months, but what has happened over the last couple of years. We paid back the entirety of the school shift. I never thought we could do that. Having chaired the Finance Committee during that first decade, I never thought with the size of the school shift that was passed in 11 and 12 that we'd ever be able to do that. We did that. As pointed out by the Budget Director, we paid back every statutory deficit that was required by state law. You couple that with a budget surplus. Keep in mind that the Economic Trends, the Budget Trends Commission suggested a surplus of somewhat greater. We have a surplus amount that will put us in good position for any future downturns. And so you look at what we've done to try to create a structurally balanced budget for the first time in years. And I think the DFL, with the leadership of Governor Dayton, then Speaker Thiessen, Majority Leader Bach, can take a lot of pride in what we've accomplished over these last 2 years, showing Minnesotans we really can run state government and do so in a structurally balanced way. Second, we've listened to the governor outline some of his concerns relative to how money ought to be spent, and certainly in a couple of areas, many areas, I applaud him strongly. Certainly from my particular perspective, what he's laid out for in education, and particularly in higher education. You know, that was a sector that over that first decade we just clobbered over and over again. And the chance to finally revitalize the University of Minnesota and the MnSCU systems is something that I look forward to doing this year as the governor has outlined. Another comment I might add is we've heard talk about the unemployment rate. You know, it used to be that Minnesota was always ahead of the national curve. And again, in that first decade, Minnesota was behind the national curve economically. Now, once more, we're ahead of the national curve with the 5th lowest unemployment rate in the country. And the 5th lowest unemployment rate, not only in the country, but I would suggest, if I'm not mistaken, of any of the mid-sized or larger states, we have the lowest unemployment rate, if I'm not mistaken. And to be fair, one of the states that has a lower unemployment rate is a state to the west of us, North Dakota, which is a state that is a single sector economy, and that unemployment rate will probably, I would guess, not stick as it has been the last couple of years. The last comment I would make, I know there were a couple of questions about should we give out rebates and should we do things like that. I'm not going to speak for Senator Skoye and what he might do with the tax committee, but I recall that when we gave out tax rebates, gave out financial rebates in, I think, 99, 2000. I believe I got about $250 or whatever I got. I was very happy to use that on half a ticket to New York City. It was a great weekend, had a lot of fun. And I then made up for it over the next decade by higher property taxes, higher fees, and any number of other things that didn't eliminate the enjoyment I had in New York, but certainly put paying for that airplane ticket in perspective. So I think the chance to do some very constructive things with this budget surplus in a way that's going to build for a future stronger Minnesota is something we're very excited about, and certainly proud of having laid the groundwork for that in the 13-14 session. Last comment I would make is obviously you can't talk about this without looking at the national economy with the incredible job growth that's taken place in the last year or so nationally, the change in the national economic picture, and how that reflects in states like Minnesota. And you combine all of that, and you look forward, I think, with Governor Dayton's proposals to a future in Minnesota that's going to be significant, and I think supported by the vast majority of people in Minnesota. Thank you.
Well, if you think of today's budget forecast as a report card on how Minnesota is doing, on the opportunity that's been created over the last 2 years and how state government has been managed in the last 2 years, this report card is an A. It takes off the table, first of all, any argument that we've been hearing for the last 2 years that Republicans have made, that the economy would flatline because of a DFL budget. As Senator Cohen just pointed out, our unemployment is among the lowest in the country. Our consumer confidence is the highest in the whole country. Our CEO confidence is extremely high, and in fact higher in greater Minnesota than it is in the metropolitan area. Our businesses are expanding, and most critically, and the biggest news I think actually coming out of this forecast is that wages are growing again. And that's, I think, the best news for Minnesotans shown in this report, because that has been a struggle, but we are now at long last seeing some substantial and good wage growth in Minnesota. It really is time for the economic climate change deniers to set aside their arguments. The real question, though, is what we're going to do going forward, because we do have a great opportunity here. This is an exciting time for Minnesota. Are we going to use this money, this surplus money, for tax cuts for the rich and for well-connected corporate elites, as the Republicans have said is their priority and acted as if it is their priority with their bill introductions? Or will we accept, and will they accept, the reality of this report, that we are on the right track and that we will continue to build on the progress of the last 2 years? And I certainly hope it's the latter. Our investments in education, from early childhood education to a college tuition freeze, and I was pleased to hear the governor encouraging us to do that once again for the next 2 years. Our investments in long-term care, our investments in economic development across this state that I think are going to continue to pay off, including investments in broadband. All of these things are things that we should continue in the state of Minnesota as we move forward, and I hope that that is the direction that this legislature takes. I just want to end with a few quick reminders. 1 year ago, we were standing here for the February forecast in 2014, and Representative Doudt, now Speaker Doudt, stood up and introduced the Give It All Back Act. I don't know if you all remember that. He doesn't always want to remember that these days. But he said, you know, this money doesn't belong to government. We need to send it back to taxpayers. And of course what they have in mind is corporate taxpayers and dead rich people and other rich people. But it'll be interesting to see if today their approach is going to be the same. Is it again time for the Republicans to introduce the Give It All Back Act? It'll be curious to see that. And then last month, I also think it's important that we remind folks that when the governor introduced his spending bill based on the prior forecast, which I think was about $930 million in spending, the Republicans at that time said that is way too much spending. And so if they are, you know, this new forecast actually shouldn't change that. If it was too much spending a month ago, $930 million should be too much spending today. In fact, significantly too much spending today. So I'm going to be curious to watch over the next 3 weeks as the House comes up with their budget targets to see if they're going to stay true to their word on the campaign trail, to see if they're going to stay true to their word in the last couple months, or whether they change their mind and will acknowledge that what we did in the last 2 years was actually the right thing for Minnesota and join us in moving Minnesota forward. Thanks. If you want to.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to add, other than to say that having been very involved with the budget last session, for our caucus it was all about creating opportunity for working Minnesotans. And as Senator Cohen and former Speaker and now Minority Leader Thiessen have pointed out, those investments have paid just huge dividends, whether you look at our unemployment rate, whether you look at our economic growth, any way you want to measure it. Minnesota, the one point that I would make that perhaps was missed was that if you read some of the national publications, Minnesota is one of the best places to do business. We're ranked very high in that regard. So hopefully this budget sets that debate aside when you look at the success of our economy.
Thank you. This is a good day for Minnesota, and I hope Minnesotans are in their homes tonight each doing a humble brag for the hard work that they have done to bring us to this place. And the question for this legislature, of course, is what will we do with this budget surplus? And I am not the historian that either Lynn Carlson or Dick Cohen are about the legislature, but I do remember past legislatures facing an opportunity like this one and making the short-term choice of returning money back to Minnesotans, making the argument that they know best what to do with it. I think we have to think about our future. And as Governor Dayton said, we should be thinking about closing the achievement gap for real and investing in pre-K and early education. And we should remove the debt from students who are really struggling to get on with their life post-college in career because their debt is so high. And we should be thinking about the seniors who have lived in Minnesota, who have made Minnesota what it is, and make sure we're honoring them by making sure we're investing well in their future. We always have a choice. This legislature has a choice. I hope we make one for the future of Minnesota, and at the same time, I hope that we remember that part of our job is to make life just a little bit easier for the working people of Minnesota, and that's our aim. Thank you.
I apologize. I forgot one thing I just wanted to mention. And one of the things I love about this place over the years is our total, on all sides, lack of context. And here's why I mentioned that. Here's why I mentioned that. Because if we get into a debate about give it all back, spend it all, do whatever we want, I would just remind folks of the remarkably discredited economic theory of supply-side economics. There was a question earlier about Wisconsin. Everybody keep in mind the state of Kansas. Governor Brownback, running for re-election in a Republican year in one of the most Republican states in the country, was almost defeated because he gave it all back, and Kansas is in the worst shape of any country in the country, and his deficit grew after the first of the year. So if that's the kind of theory the House Republicans might suggest, I can only ask them to pick up Kansas newspapers and take a look as to what's going on in the state of Kansas.
Any questions?
Senator Cohen, the Senate DFL has already outlined lots of new money for education spending and workforce training and so on, maybe for Senator Hayden as well. Can you give people an idea of what you're likely to recommend for the new $800 million?
Well, I think the governor laid it out pretty decently. I think we'll look at something additional for higher education. I mentioned that a minute ago. The governor's proposed some additional spending for E-12 education, and I think that's something that both sectors have been underfunded and not paid enough attention to over the last number of years. I'm not going to fault everything that happened during the time of Governor Pawlenty's administration. There were national economic forces at play that went far beyond the state of Minnesota. But in that process, and certainly in 11-12, we just clobbered what's important to Minnesota in terms of education. So you can bet that'll be in the Senate budget, very similar to what the governor's proposed.
Senator Hayden, would you weigh in universal pre-K? The governor just said, again, that's got to be a priority. Your Democratic friends in the House want that. What's realistically the chance 2 out of 3 entities really want universal pre-K? Is it possible that that could come out of session?
Well, we're hopeful. It's definitely a priority for us. Early childhood as a whole, I know, will get a really good look, universal pre-K, and this ideal of what to balance with the education scholarships, as well as buying down some of the wait lists for the low-income folks, the CCAP grant. So I know that those are things that members in my caucus really, really want to talk about. It appears to be. Well, I guess that's the conversation we're going to have. I would hope. I mean, these are our youngest learners. These are the folks that we know our future. That's going to be our future, and we know that that works. So hopefully it just doesn't become hyper political in this issue, and that we actually do what's good for the 4-year-olds in Minnesota, 3- and 4-year-olds.
Senator, with this kind of a surplus of nearly $2 billion, does Minnesota still need a gas tax hike?
Well, I think the governor talked about having a dedicated revenue source. Was talking to some folks before, and we need to invest in our infrastructure over time, and so even taking some cash and putting it in is kind of like a payment on a long-term mortgage. We really need to fix these roads. We really need to make sure that our transit and our transportation efforts are consistent. So I think the governor...
Not use any of this money for transportation, particularly that would be from a gas tax?
Well, I just think that we're going to have the conversation to really talk about what do we need to do, but a dedicated revenue source, I think, is something that we agree is going to be needed. How that looks today and this year with this message, I think, is a conversation we're going to have.
The governor talked about tuition freezes on higher ed campuses. Are senators still interested in this minuscule free tuition idea?
Well, again, however you structure the money, I think we'll put more money into higher education. And obviously we try to affect a balance between the the University of Minnesota system and the MnSCU system. We've got the unique feature this year of the University of Medical School, and I think that'll be a strong Senate priority to make sure that we start putting the med school back to where it was, 20 and 30 years ago. But I think we'll certainly try to give support to both the President and the Chancellor in trying to keep tuition rates at a reasonable level, coupled with, most importantly, what the Governor also mentioned, which is to increase the state grant program. So we can get back to a higher education system that's not only a quality system, which it is, but a system that is an affordable system for the kids of Minnesota. And that sounds like just so much rhetoric, but I mean, we all have our stories, both on an anecdotal and an empirical basis, of what's happened with tuition for public schools in this state. We've got some superb private colleges, several of which are in my district, but what we owe our obligation to is the public schools and the public systems.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited. Today is a good day for Minnesotans. Obviously, the economic environment in Minnesota has improved. It's improved pretty substantially since the November forecast, where we actually saw a downgrade in future revenues. So we're very excited about that. I'm also excited to see where that's coming from. And I think that I would challenge my Democrat colleagues to read a little deeper into these documents to find out where that surplus comes from. I'm partly excited because I think that this surplus means that Democrats can stop talking about a gas tax in St. Paul. This surplus is partly due to the fact that gas prices are low. And low gas prices don't magically improve Minnesota's economy. What happens is low gas prices leave more money in the pockets of Minnesota families. And that is what improves Minnesota's economy. And that's what this is due to. Democrats can attempt to make victory laps on claiming that their policies over the last 2 years improved Minnesota's economy. But we got the report card on that last November, when the forecast downgraded revenues in the next biennium by $400 million. Now we've seen an improvement, and I challenge them to look at why that improvement has happened. So not only has that money left more money in the pockets of Minnesota families, the Democrats still today, and I'm really disappointed to hear that not only are they going to spend all of this surplus money, but they're still proposing a huge tax increase on Minnesota families in the form of a gas tax. It's a regressive tax, and it really hurts Minnesota families a lot. And I hope that Democrats, and I'm going to challenge the governor and challenge Democrats in the Senate to take this off the table. It doesn't make any logical sense for Senate Democrats and the governor to be proposing a huge tax increase on Minnesota families when Minnesota has a $1.8 billion surplus. What we should do is look at these documents and learn from them that leaving more money in the pockets of Minnesota families is what helped Minnesota's economy. So we're going to have a few priorities this session. Obviously, we're going to give some of this surplus back to Minnesotans, and we're going to do it in a meaningful way that helps them. And we know that from this surplus we've learned, or this forecast we've learned, that that's what's going to help Minnesota families, and it's going to help Minnesota's economy. Part of our priorities that we've talked about this session, obviously growing more better paying jobs for all Minnesotans. That's our #1 priority, and that's really been the driver in this economic forecast. We're going to make sure that every child in the state of Minnesota receives the world-class education they deserve. Part of that will mean that we're going to put some new money into K-12 education. We're going to protect aging adults' quality of life. This is a place where the governor has really not come forward as a leader, saying that we're going to fix some of the problems in reimbursing our nursing homes and taking care of those aging folks in Minnesota. We're going to refocus our transportation dollars on roads and bridges, and we're going to do it with real money, new money, right now. And we can do that without putting a gas tax in place and without raising a tax on Minnesota families. And we're going to ensure fair access and affordability in our health care. We're going to make sure that we fix the problems with MNsure as best we can, and we're going to need the Democrats' help on that. But that means that we need them to admit that there's some problems. So those are the things that we're going to focus on. We think this forecast is good news for Minnesotans, and we hope that the Democrats will take the gas tax off the table.
Well, this is the first time I've been in St. Paul on Friday in a while. The Speaker and I have both been traveling throughout the state, Little Falls, Wilmer, Waconia, Morris, Brainerd, Duluth, Faribault, Monticello, Bemidji, amongst others. And what we've heard is that Minnesotans are overtaxed. So it's no surprise that when the Democrats came forward with a $2.1 billion tax increase in 2013, that there's a surplus now. That, in addition to the additional money that folks have in their pocket after the lower gas prices, leads me to believe that gas tax is the absolute wrong way to go. I'm highly disappointed that Senator Hayden did not take that off the table. The reason that part of the reason we're having an improved economy is because of the lower gas prices. So to propose a 16-cent gas tax on Minnesotans is absolutely the wrong direction. What we need to do is we need to help out our taxpayers. We need to provide some tax relief. And so I would challenge the Senate as well to take the gas tax off the table, to look what we can do for Minnesotans, because our job is to be good fiscal stewards for the state of Minnesota, and I challenge the Democrats to do that.
Well, we are showing in our forecast about $2 billion of surplus money projected, and my question is very simply, who can, with a straight face, propose to the people of Minnesota that we need another tax? And just to remind people of the state, back in 2011, when we did have a deficit, when Republicans were in the majority, the governor was insistent that we needed a big tax increase, and we didn't do it. And then in 13, when the Democrats were in the majority, the governor said we need a big tax increase, and we got it. And now we've got a surplus, and we say we need a big tax increase as well. That just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it makes sense to the people of Minnesota. And on our side, we are going to work with the House majority to talk about tax reform, tax relief, broadly. There's a lot of ideas we can talk about that we ought to be thinking about. That's what we should have this conversation about this year. Not about more spending, but how to do tax relief in a meaningful way that results in opportunities for people in this economy, investment in the economy. That's what we need to have. We will be proposing spending, but it's spending that's targeted on results. I think the fact that we say we are spending money, and by virtue of that we've done something, we ought to quit doing that. We ought to show what we're getting for that spending. Simply doing more of it doesn't necessarily mean we've accomplished anything. We need to be smart about how we spend money. We need to look at results, and we need to figure out how we can do the best job we can to create opportunities for all people in Minnesota. That means let's stop collecting excess taxes that we don't need. Let's find ways to return that to the people who've paid them.
Well, listening to the governor and my Democratic friends, I just have to wonder, how big of a surplus would we have for them to actually propose that hardworking Minnesota families got some back? In November, we heard there was a $1 billion surplus, and their response was, well, no, we can't provide any tax relief there, and in fact, we have to add a 16-cent gas tax increase, 16 cents a gallon. Now we have an almost $2 billion surplus, and the response is, no, we can't provide any tax relief to hardworking Minnesota families, and we still need that 16 cents a gallon tax increase. You know, how big would it have to be? 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion? Is there any number at which our Democratic friends would actually say, government has enough, I guess we could give some back to some of our hardworking Minnesota families? I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that question, but from the Republican side, we believe that we have some money here to provide tax relief to hardworking Minnesota families.
So with that, you know, obviously our priority is going to be on Minnesota families, and you see that here. You know, we need to put the priority back on Minnesota families and not on government. You know, the Democrats have stood here all too often saying one thing, and then they go to their chambers and do another. And what I'm talking about is instead of investing in the roads and bridges that they should have over the last 2 years, they invested in office buildings for themselves and pay raises for commissioners. And for too long, Democrats have put the priority here in St. Paul on politicians and not on Minnesota families. And when the state has a $1.8 or $1.9 billion surplus, now's the time, you know, let's pay attention to where that surplus came from and the fact that it was money in the pockets of Minnesota families that grew the economy and spurred the economic growth, and that's the reason we have the surplus. Let's follow a successful model. Let's give some money back to Minnesotans. Let's invest in them. Let's let them invest in their families. And that, in turn, will help and benefit everybody in Minnesota. So with that, I'll answer questions.
What kind of tax relief are you talking about? Are you talking about income tax cuts? Are you talking about Kurt checks or what?
That's not a bad idea. No, I'm teasing. You know, I think what we're going to do is look at where the money is going to do the most good. And I know Democrats are going to tell you that building a Senate office building and giving pay raises to their commissioners is the best way to spend tax dollars in Minnesota. But unfortunately, we don't agree. We think the best way would be putting the money back in the pockets of Minnesotans, middle-class Minnesotans, you know, folks that are working really hard and struggling to make ends meet. And that's going to be our focus. If that means, you know, we'll look at things like helping out our senior citizens by exempting Social Security income, exempting veterans benefits. There's a number of things on the table that we can do. But those are the things that we should be prioritizing here in St. Paul, not how we can spend more money on office buildings and pay raises for commissioners. So that's where our priority is going to be.
So individual tax relief, not business tax relief, like Democrats say you want to do.
Well, you look at where money comes from for the state. This is why I'm so baffled at why Democrats can't figure this out. I mean, even in the revenue forecast today, I've been saying for months and a couple of years now, let's look at where the revenue comes from. It comes from income tax and sales tax for the most part. 33 billion of the 41, or a little more than that, comes from income tax and sales tax. What do we need for Minnesota's budget to be successful? We need Minnesotans to make more money. Plain and simple. That's what's going to grow Minnesota's economy, and taking more money out of their family budgets just frankly isn't going to help the state, and it's not going to help those Minnesota families. So why don't we look at a solution that we know works? We see it in this forecast. Let's put some money back in the pockets of Minnesota families, and let's do it in a meaningful way. And that's our priority.
Mr. Speaker, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when Ventura did it, the governor, I think, can make a pretty fair case that a lot of things changed after that. Isn't that true, that the budget since then has not been able to reach the levels of surplus, of any kind of reserves, all of that?
You know, let's just look at what happened today. You know, we've got a budget surplus of $1.8 million, or almost $1.9 billion, and you look at where it came from, it has a lot to do with the fact that gas prices are low, okay? So we've got a $1.9 billion surplus. What do Democrats want to do? They're proposing today to raise taxes, because that's not enough, okay? But what that did, the low gas prices, it left money in Minnesota family budgets. And what are Democrats proposing to do? They're proposing to raise the price of gasoline in Minnesota. Is anybody paying attention here? I am, and I think Minnesotans are too. This is the wrong approach. They obviously wrote their talking points for today's press conference before they read the forecast documents. And I challenge them. Show me how taking money out of Minnesota families' pockets has helped. We got the report card on their last 2 years in November, when revenue forecast for this biennium, the next biennium, was reduced by $400 million. And today it's increasing by $600 million. Why? Minnesota families are doing better, mostly because they have more money in their family budgets because the gas prices are lower. The Democrats' response, take more money from families and raise the price of gasoline. Doesn't make any sense.
So are you talking about something that will do sort of a widespread tax relief that all or most Minnesotans will feel, or are you talking about more of a sort of a targeted tax credit approach for certain sectors?
You know, I think really anything's on the table. I think we need to look at who could use the help, and really where we feel like that investment would spur Minnesota's economy to grow further. You know, frankly, I think Minnesotans have been struggling. I look at the statistics of you know, average income for the Minnesota families lagging behind inflation by $4,300 over the last 7 years. Haven't they struggled enough? While government's doing things like building a Senate office building and giving pay raises to the commissioners of 30%, how many Minnesotans have seen a 30% increase in their pay? And today, what did we find out? That the Democrats want to double down on taking more money out of the pockets of Minnesota families? It just doesn't make any logical sense. So yes, we're going to look at, you know, whether we target that to specific groups of Minnesotans. We'll look at all groups of Minnesotans, but we certainly need to make sure that we're putting the money back in the pockets of the people that need it.
Are you talking about all of this new $800 $800 million going back to taxpayers in some form, or is there some spending that your caucus will recommend, or how do you come down?
You know, we've said very clearly that we've got priorities, and I mentioned that already. We want to invest some money into K-12 education. We want to invest some money into nursing homes, and we are going to invest money in our road and bridge infrastructure in Minnesota. We're going to do it in a meaningful way with real money, and we're going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt Minnesota families. But we're going to, with probably the majority of this money, we're going to propose to give it back to Minnesotans. And I guess Governor Dayton and the Democrats in the Senate are going to have to make the argument to Minnesotans that Minnesotans don't deserve their money back.
How much more money would you put into transportation? There's $200 million now.
We've been very clear about the fact that we want to go through the next month or so talking about what the need is. Obviously, Minnesota received this TFACT report about a little more than 2 years ago. So Democrats, while they had complete control of state government and could have done anything they wanted, sat on this report and did nothing while they were building Senate office buildings and giving pay raises to their commissioners. You know, what we want to do is figure out what the need is. Let's take a look at, let's dust off that TFACT report. Let's take a look at it, see if it's still relevant, see if it still makes sense, see if we can agree with the Democrats in the Senate and the governor on what the need actually is. If it's $5 billion, $4 billion, $6 billion over the next 10 years, let's figure out what that is. But we can meet the need over the next 10 years without a gas tax. But the problem is, and the reason the Democrats don't want to do that is because they want to spend all this money on other things. They keep saying that roads and bridges are their priority, but their actions don't match their words, and that's the problem.
Mr. Speaker, how much of the surplus are you willing to say you want to give back?
As much as possible. I think Minnesotans deserve that. Let's figure out what we need to spend to provide the services that Minnesotans expect from state government. Let's figure out how much it takes to repair our roads and bridges and to make sure that every child in the state of Minnesota gets the world-class education they deserve. Let's make sure that we're showing senior citizens the respect they deserve in our long-term care facilities. And once we've figured out that we can take care of all those things, let's give the rest of it back to Minnesotans. When you have a budget surplus, it means that you've collected too much money from Minnesotans. So we need to make sure that we give it back. And we know today from this forecast that that's what actually has grown Minnesota's economy. That's what has helped, leaving money in the pockets of Minnesotans. So that's what we're going to propose.
Could you put a finer point on as much as possible? Are we talking about, I think one of the releases I got said this is worth $350 per Minnesotans. I think that was from your party. Are you talking about giving back $100 per Minnesotan?
I think that you saw yesterday, and this probably will be very refreshing to Minnesotans because they haven't seen a lot of this over the last 2 years, but I think you saw yesterday that Republicans are going to be very thoughtful and very reasonable, and we're going to go through the process of making sure that we take care of our priorities, and whatever's left, we're not going to figure out ways to spend it. We're going to give it back to Minnesotans, but we can meet all the needs that Minnesotans expect us to and still give a large portion of this money back to Minnesotans. And that's what we're going to propose to do.
Mr. Speaker, we're hearing office building and salary commissioners a lot.
Oh.
Those issues
Did I
not
mention
done
that?
yet for you?
Guys, the reason I say it is because it really demonstrates how out of touch Democrats are with Minnesotans. The fact that the governor and House and Senate Democrats could stand in front of Minnesota today when we have a $1.8 billion surplus and propose not any tax cuts, not giving any money back to Minnesota families, but to increase taxes and do it in a regressive way that really hurts Minnesota families by raising the gas tax. I come from a district that really was hit hard by the housing bubble, but it wasn't just the housing bubble. I mean, Isani County, where I come from, was one of the fastest growing counties in the country during the good times. Really a boom and a bust story, and just a couple of years later had some of the highest foreclosure rates in the country. It wasn't just the housing bubble that happened during that 2-year period. Gas prices went from $2 a gallon to $4 a gallon, and people in my district lost their homes because gas prices doubled. And I don't know if the governor needs to spend more time out in greater Minnesota. This is my first Friday at the Capitol. I got a list of the cities I've been to: Brainerd, Faribault, Spring Valley, Bemidji, Park Rapids, St. Cloud, Black Duck, LaPorte, Fountain, Duluth, and Stacy. The governor needs to get out of St. Paul. He needs to understand that raising the gas tax is going to hurt Minnesota families. And I'd welcome him to come to my district, and I'll invite him to the cafes, and we can visit with folks in my district, some of whom lost their homes because gas prices doubled.
What do salary commissioners and office buildings have to do with the surplus?
Well, I think what it demonstrates is that Democrats have come to St. Paul saying that they're going to do all these great things for Minnesotans, but their priority hasn't been on Minnesotans. It's been on themselves. And I think Minnesotans are frustrated. I think that's why Republicans won the majority in the House. And I think that part of this economic confidence has to do with the fact that there's balance restored in state government. Democrats are out of touch with Minnesotans. The words that they spoke to you today demonstrate that very clearly. And we're going to make sure that we return our priority back on Minnesota families.
Right, that theory, the theory that this forecast is good because Republicans now have the House and there's balance restored to the Capitol. Tell me more about that.
The voters spoke very clearly in November that they didn't like the direction that Democrats were taking. I think the November forecast represented very clearly that the policies they put in place last year and the year before didn't help Minnesota families, and they didn't help Minnesota's economy, okay? Remember that in November they downgraded the revenues in the next biennium by $400 million. Today we've seen that increase. Why? Mostly because gas prices are low. But I think also Minnesota's economy understands that we don't have a runaway government that, when we didn't need to raise any taxes, put in place one of the largest tax increases in state history. I think people have confidence in the fact that balance has been restored in state government.
Governor Dayton got 1 million votes. Governor Dayton got 1 million votes. See, Governor Dayton was reelected. Isn't that an endorsement of what his plans?
House Republicans received, I forget the number, 100,000 more votes than House Democrats statewide. We also won the majority, and we won it in places like, Black Duck and LaPorte and Fountain and Stacy and Faribault. And I think the governor needs to pay attention to what Minnesotans are saying, and I can't believe how tone-deaf Democrats are today to think that we have a $1.8 billion surplus, and they want to spend not only all of that, but they want to, on top of that, raise a gas tax. Minnesotans already gave us money to pay for roads and bridges, and we have more than enough to spend a lot more money on roads and bridges today. We don't need to raise a gas tax.
It was clear Democrats took credit for the budget surplus. Up to there. Are you going to take credit for the budget surplus from December on then, Mr. Speaker?
Go ahead.
You're taking credit for the
No, I'm not. Minnesotans deserve the credit. Read the forecast documents. Where did it come from? It came from lower oil prices and a rising dollar affect economic growth. It's not, you look at job growth and wage growth in Minnesota, it's still lags behind the national average right now. That's a problem. You look at where income and revenue comes from for the state, it comes from Minnesotans. We need to show them that we respect that. And let's let them invest in their lives for once, instead of letting Democrats invest in office buildings and commissioners' pay raises in St. Paul. Let's invest in Minnesotans. We believe in Minnesotans, and now is the opportunity for everybody's actions to match their words, and that's what you'll see out of the Republicans.
Speaker, following up on what you've said about, Speaker?
Yes, sorry. I want the others to have a chance, too.
Following up on what you already said, I'm trying to get this clear. Are you talking about any tax relief would only come out of the surplus? Do not try to roll back the $2 billion in tax increases that you've complained about?
We may, we likely will, I should say. Obviously, spending has grown in the state of Minnesota, a huge amount under Democrat control. What the governor's proposing is about a little more than a 20% increase in state spending since that first budget in 2011. That's not sustainable. Have Minnesota families seen a 20% increase in their budgets? He's given his commissioners a 30% increase in salaries. That's on top of the 5% and 5% the 2 previous years. Have Minnesota families seen that sort of surplus? No. So what we need to make sure is that we're looking at Minnesota not just today in this next 2 years, but that we're really looking at what is going to help Minnesotans over the long term. And I haven't seen a long-term vision. the Democrats talk about wanting a 10-year plan for Minnesota in transportation, but they refuse to look at what Minnesota is going to look like 10 years from now if we continue the kind of tax increases and spending increases that they've been on for the last 2 years. So I believe in Minnesotans. I believe that we need to make some basic investments in things that I think Minnesotans expect, like senior citizens and K-12 education and road and bridge infrastructure. And I think we can do that within the budget that we have and still give a large portion of the surplus back to Minnesotans where it's going to do the most good.
Will you look at scrapping the fourth tier?
Go ahead, Senator.
Actually, I don't want to talk about the fourth tier. I want to challenge Governor Dayton. When gas prices drop below $2, you would not believe the collective sigh of relief among my family and friends. You have no idea what it means to a family to see a major expense for commuting, for running their business, drop from $4 to $2. I mean, they were joyful. It was all over social media how happy they were. And for the governor to not get that, the surplus is because those families took that extra $2 a gallon and spent a little more on Christmas. Maybe they saved a little more. Maybe they bought a car so their 16-year-old could go to work and start saving for college. Those families made this a difference. And the fact that the governor won't think of them first and take the gas tax off the table when there's almost $2 billion in surplus is unconscionable. Thank you.
Tier on the table, or is that something?
You know, we're not really looking at that. I think if we look at tax relief for Minnesota families, at putting some money back in their pockets, we're going to look at everybody, not just single out, you know, one group. I know the Democrats might think that that's what we would do, but no. I mean, we're going to look at putting money back in the pockets of Minnesota families, and that means all of them. So if we did look at the income tax, it would be all tiers of the income tax.
Are you talking about giving back? Are you saying a majority? Are you saying $900 million will go back in tax cuts or checks or something?
Yes.
You're saying at least $900 million?
At least that much. Probably a lot more than that. Yeah.